The dirt under Daniel Reed's fingernails never really came clean anymore. 3 years on Verdant 7 had taught him that some stains were just permanent reminders of honest work. He sat on an overturned crate at the edge of the greenhouse complex, unwrapping his daily ration with fingers that still smelled like fertilizer and growing soil. Lunch was the same as always. One protein bar that tasted like cardboard mixed with artificial strawberry, and a pouch of synthesized orange juice that had never seen a real orange in its entire existence. Daniel didn't complain. Half the colony went hungry some months when the supply ships ran late. At least the greenhouse work meant he occasionally got to eat actual vegetables, even if they were the slightly damaged ones nobody else wanted. The other botanists had already gone back inside where the temperature regulators kept everything comfortable. Daniel preferred eating out here, where Verdant 7's twin suns painted the sky in shades of purple and gold that Earth's single sun could never match. The alien grass surrounding the colony swayed in colors between blue and green, and strange birds with 4 wings called to each other in the distance. Something rustled in the tall grass about 20 feet away. Daniel looked up from his protein bar, squinting against the afternoon light. Probably just one of those rabbit-sized creatures with the spiral horns. They like to steal vegetables from the compost heap. He'd chased away 3 of them just yesterday. The rustling came again, weaker this time. More of a trembling than actual movement. Daniel set down his lunch and walked over, pushing aside the chest-high grass with both hands. The stalks were tough and left thin scratches on his forearms, but he'd gotten used to that too. What he found wasn't a rabbit creature. It was something he'd never seen before in all his time on Verdant 7, and the colony's orientation manual hadn't mentioned anything like it either. The thing was roughly the size of a house cat, covered in scales that might have been golden once but now looked dull and cracked like old paint. It had 4 legs, a long tail, and a head that was almost triangular with 2 small horns barely poking through the scales. The creature's eyes were closed. Its breathing came in shallow, desperate gasps that made its whole body shudder. Ribs showed clearly through the scales on its sides. Daniel had seen starvation before, back on Earth in the refugee camps before he'd signed up for colony work. This creature was dying. He knew the smart thing was to walk away. The colony had strict rules about interference with local wildlife. They'd lost 2 people last year who'd tried to pet something that looked cute, but turned out to have poisonous spines. Resources were tight enough without wasting them on every sick animal someone found in the grass. Daniel went back to his crate anyway, grabbed his lunch, and returned to the dying creature. He knelt down slowly, making himself small and non-threatening. The creature's eyes cracked open just a sliver. They were bright amber, with a depth of awareness that seemed almost human, almost like it was actually looking at him, not just seeing a potential threat. He broke off a piece of his protein bar and held it out. The creature didn't move. Daniel set the piece down right next to its mouth and backed up a foot, sitting cross-legged in the grass. He waited. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Finally, a long tongue, pale pink and forked at the end, emerged and pulled the protein bar piece into its mouth. The creature chewed slowly, painfully, but it swallowed. Daniel broke off another piece and moved it a little closer. This time the weight was shorter. By the time the protein bar was gone, the creature had managed to lift its head slightly. Daniel opened his juice pouch and carefully dribbled some of the liquid near its mouth. The creature drank desperately, and Daniel had to pull the pouch back so it wouldn't choke. When everything was gone, Daniel stood up. He'd given away his entire lunch, and his stomach was already complaining about it. His shift didn't end for another 4 hours. He looked down at the creature, which had settled its head back on the ground but was watching him with those intelligent amber eyes. "I'll be back tomorrow," Daniel said, feeling foolish for talking to an animal. "Try not to die before then." He returned to the greenhouse, endured the afternoon of pruning tomato plants and checking mineral levels, and tried to ignore his hunger. That evening, he traded his dessert ration for the next 3 days to get an extra protein bar from someone. In the morning, he went back to the spot in the grass. The creature was still there, still alive. It raised its head when it saw him, and something in Daniel's chest loosened with relief he hadn't expected to feel. He sat down and shared his breakfast. This time, the creature ate more steadily, drank without choking, even managed to sit up partially. Daniel didn't know what he'd found or why he was doing this. He just knew that walking away felt wrong in a way he couldn't explain. So he didn't. Every day for the next 2 weeks he came back. split his meals, brought water, watched as the creature slowly recovered. Its scales began to shine. The golden color emerged like sunrise breaking through clouds, bright and warm. The creature grew stronger, started moving around, though it never tried to leave. Sometimes Daniel would sit and talk about his day, about the tomatoes that weren't growing right, about how much he missed Earth's real rain. The creature would tilt its head and listen like it understood every word. Other colonists noticed eventually. They saw him sneaking extra food, saw him disappearing to the same spot every day. Most thought he was crazy. Some told him he was wasting resources the colony couldn't spare. A few suggested that if the animal was healthy enough now, he should probably chase it off before it got used to humans and became a problem. Daniel ignored them all. He'd named the creature Ember, though he never said the name out loud where anyone else could hear. That would have been too embarrassing, like admitting he'd gotten attached to something he'd probably never see again, once it was strong enough to return to wherever it had come from. On the 16th day, Daniel arrived at dawn with his breakfast ration only to find the grass empty. Ember was gone. No signs of struggle, no tracks leading away. Just gone like it had never been there at all. Daniel stood in the empty spot for a long time, feeling an absence he hadn't prepared himself for. He told himself it was good. The creature had recovered and returned to its life. That was the point. That was how it was supposed to work. He went back to the greenhouse and tried to focus on his plants and pretend the empty feeling in his chest was just regular hunger. 3 weeks passed. Daniel's life returned to normal, the same routine it had always been, until the day the alarm started screaming, and someone came running through the greenhouse shouting that there was an unidentified ship in orbit, and it was big enough to hold the entire colony inside it. Daniel had never seen the entire colony gather in one place before. Every single person from Verdant 7's 300 residents stood in the main square, staring up at the sky where something impossible blocked out the stars. The ship didn't look like it was built. It looked like it had been grown. All organic curves and crystalline edges that caught the light from Verdant 7's suns and scattered it into 1,000 rainbow fragments. Governor. Wells stood on the platform usually reserved for weekly announcements, her face pale as paper. She kept one hand on her communicator like it was a lifeline, and her voice shook when she spoke. They're requesting to land. They've asked specifically for our colony. I've tried to contact the fleet command, but they're saying we should cooperate fully and avoid any actions that could be interpreted as hostile. Who are they? Someone shouted from the crowd. They call themselves the Drakari. Wells swallowed hard. Fleet command says they're real, ancient, powerful, and they've never contacted humanity before. Not once in all the years we've been exploring space. Daniel felt something cold settle in his stomach. The name meant nothing to him, but the fear in Wells' voice meant everything. Whatever was coming, it wasn't good news. He pushed that thought down and focused on the sky. 2 shapes were descending now, but they weren't shuttlecraft. They were flying under their own power, like birds, except birds didn't glow with internal fire as they moved. The shapes resolved as they got closer. Daniel's mind struggled to process what he was seeing. They were massive, easily 12 feet tall, with bodies that seemed to be made of muscle wrapped in scales that shimmered red like hot metal. They had wings that spread wide enough to cast shadows over half the square, and tails that moved with predatory grace. Their faces were elongated and reptilian, with eyes that burned like forge fires and teeth that caught the light when they opened their mouths to breathe. Dragons. They looked like the dragons from old Earth stories, from fantasy books and ancient myths. Except those were supposed to be fiction, made up, impossible. These were very, very real, and they were landing in the square with movements that made the ground tremble slightly under their weight. The leader stood taller than the rest, covered in crimson scales that seemed to contain actual fire just beneath the surface. When it spoke, the voice came out in perfect human language, though it rumbled like distant thunder. "We seek the human called Daniel Reed. Bring him forward." The crowd parted. Daniel felt every eye turned toward him. His legs felt like they'd been filled with water, but somehow he managed to walk forward, stopping about 10 feet from the massive reptilian being. Up close, he could see the way its scales overlapped, each one etched with patterns too fine for accident. This was a creature of age, of power, of something beyond his understanding. "I'm Daniel Reed," he managed, and hated how small his voice sounded. The dragon lowered its head, bringing those burning eyes level with his. Daniel forced himself not to step backward. Then impossibly the creature's front legs bent and its wings folded and it bowed. Actually bowed to him, lowering its head until it was beneath Daniel's eye level. The gasp from the crowd was audible. The other dragon beings shifted, looking shocked. One of them made a sound of protest that got cut off by a gesture from the leader. "I am High Commander Saren of the Drakari Imperial Fleet," the dragon said, still bowing. "You saved my son, the Prince of the Dragon Emperor's bloodline. You gave him life when he was dying, asked nothing in return, and showed him kindness when you had no reason to believe it would be rewarded." Saren raised his head, and those burning eyes held something Daniel couldn't quite name. "My people have searched for 3 weeks. We tore apart pirate hideouts, interrogated smugglers, and scanned every planet in this sector. And all the while my youngest was here, with you, safe because of you." Daniel's mouth opened and closed without sound coming out. His brain was trying to process too many things at once. "Ember," he finally whispered. "You mean Ember." "His name is Prince Ashir, heir to the dragon throne, flame of the morning sky." Saren's voice held something that might have been gentle, if thunder could be gentle. "But yes, the small golden one you fed, the one you protected and nurtured back to health. My son." "I didn't know," Daniel said. "I just thought he was a local animal. He was dying. I couldn't just leave him there." "No," Saren agreed. "You could not. And that is why the Emperor himself has requested your presence on Paraxis, our homeworld. You will be honored before the Dragon Court. You will receive gifts and status beyond what most beings in this galaxy will ever know. This is not a request, Daniel Reed. This is a summons, but one given with the greatest respect my people know how to show." Governor Wells had somehow found the courage to approach. "If I may ask, High Commander, what if Mr. Reed prefers to stay? He's a citizen of this colony and has rights under human law." Saren's gaze shifted to Wells, and she took an involuntary step backward. "I am not here to kidnap him. But understand this, Governor of the small human settlement. Daniel Reed saved the life of the Emperor's grandson. In Drakari culture, this creates a debt that cannot be ignored. If he refuses to come, the Emperor himself will come here. Do you truly wish to explain to your superiors why the most powerful military force in this galaxy sent its ruler to your tiny farming colony?" Wells looked at Daniel. Everyone looked at Daniel. He thought about his plants, his small room, his quiet life of dirt under his fingernails, and shared meals with something he'd thought was just a herd animal. He thought about that amber gaze watching him every day, the way Ember had tilted his head when Daniel talked, the empty spot in the grass 3 weeks ago. "If I go," Daniel said slowly, "can I come back? This is my home." Saren's expression shifted into something that might have been respect. "You may come and go as you please. You are not a prisoner or a trophy. You are an honored guest, and after the Emperor has met you, you will be recognized as a friend to the Drakari throughout all the stars we claim. No one will prevent your return." Daniel looked at the ship in the sky, massive and impossible and terrifying. He looked at Saren, ancient and powerful, and somehow also a father who'd been searching desperately for his lost child. He thought about Ember, who was actually a prince who had listened to him talk about tomatoes and rain. "Okay," Daniel said. "I'll come." Saren rose to his full height. "You will not regret this, Daniel Reed. My people do not forget debts, and we do not make promises we cannot keep. You will be treated with honor." He turned to the rest of his delegation. "Prepare a shuttle. A proper shuttle, not a military transport. Make it comfortable for a human." One of the other dragons spoke for the first time, his voice younger but still carrying that resonant quality. "Father, are you certain? No human has set foot on Paraxis in recorded history. The court will be in chaos." "Then let there be chaos," Saren replied. "This human showed my son mercy when the boy was helpless and alone. The very least we owe him is the chance to see what his kindness has earned. Now prepare the shuttle and inform the Emperor that we are bringing his grandson savior home." Daniel was given 2 hours to pack. He didn't own much. Some clothes, a few books on plant biology, a picture of his parents from before they died. It all fit in one small bag. Other colonists came to say goodbye, some offering congratulations, others looking at him with something like pity, as if they expected him never to return. Governor Wells pulled him aside at the end. "If something goes wrong, if they try to keep you there, we'll contact the fleet. They'll send help." Daniel almost laughed. He'd seen the size of that ship in orbit. He knew somehow that if the Drakari wanted to keep him, There wasn't a fleet in human space that could do anything about it. But he appreciated the thought anyway. "I'll be fine," he told Wells. "Ember wouldn't have stayed with me if his people were the kind to hurt someone who helped them." The shuttle was everything Saren had promised. Comfortable seats sized for humans, temperature controls, even a viewport that showed the colony shrinking below as they rose toward the massive ship. Daniel pressed his hand against the glass and watched Verdant 7 become a purple and green marble, then a dot, then nothing at all. High Commander Saren sat across from him, wings folded carefully to fit the space. "You are afraid," the dragon observed. "Yes," Daniel admitted. "I've never left my planet before, and I'm about to meet an emperor of dragons. I don't even know how to act around someone like that." "Act as you did with my son," Saren said, "with honesty, with kindness. The Emperor values these things more than you know, though he has seen them rarely in his long life." The dragon looked out the viewport at the stars rushing past. "You have given my family something precious, Daniel Reed. Now let us show you what that gift has earned." Paraxis didn't look like a planet when they first approached it. It looked like someone had taken a ball of fire and taught it to hold still in space. The entire world glowed with internal heat, and as the ship descended through layers of atmosphere, Daniel saw why. Mountains floated in the air with nothing holding them up, their bases trailing streams of molten rock that never seemed to hit the ground. Rivers of liquid fire wound between crystalline structures that rose from the surface like frozen music. The sky itself shifted between shades of deep red and brilliant gold. "It's impossible," Daniel whispered against the viewport. "Those mountains, they can't just float." Saren made a sound that might have been laughter. "Not by the physics you know, perhaps, but Pyraxis was shaped by my people over thousands of generations. We made it what we needed it to be. A world where fire and stone dance together, where those with wings can fly forever without touching ground." The ship landed in what Saren called the Imperial District, though it looked more like a palace complex the size of a city. Towers of dark crystal reached toward the burning sky, connected by bridges that seemed to be made of solidified flame. Dragons flew between the structures in numbers that made Daniel's head spin. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, each one unique in color and size. Some had scales like polished copper, others like midnight studded with stars. A few were even larger than Saren, their wingspans so massive they cast shadows like clouds. When Daniel stepped off the ship, the heat hit him like walking into an oven. He gasped, and immediately a device was pressed into his hand by one of Saren's attendants. The dragon spoke in their own language, a series of growls and clicks that sounded like rocks breaking, then seemed to remember Daniel couldn't understand. "Climate regulator. It will keep your human body from cooking. Press the blue crystal to activate it." Daniel pressed it. Cool air formed around him like a bubble, dropping the temperature to something bearable. The device itself was a small metallic sphere that floated near his shoulder without any visible means of staying aloft. Just another impossible thing in a day full of them. They walked through corridors wide enough to fit 3 dragons side by side. The walls were covered in carvings that seemed to move in the flickering light, showing scenes of battles and hunts and great gatherings. Other dragons stopped to stare as they passed. Daniel heard whispers in that breaking rock language, and while he couldn't understand the words, he understood the tone. Surprise, confusion, some that sounded like anger. "They wonder why I bring a human here," Saren said quietly. "We do not allow other species into the Imperial District. It is forbidden by laws older than your civilization." "Then why am I here?" Daniel asked. "Because some laws must bend before honor, and because the Emperor commanded it." They emerged into an open courtyard where the floating mountains were visible overhead, close enough that Daniel could see vegetation growing on their undersides. A fountain in the center didn't spray water but liquid light that fell in streams and disappeared before hitting the ground. And there, lying in a patch of sunlight that somehow felt warmer than the rest of the air, was Ember. Except Ember was no longer cat-sized. He'd grown to the size of a horse, his golden scales now brilliant and perfectly formed. His horns had developed into elegant curves that swept back from his head. When he saw Daniel, He leaped up with an energy that made nearby dragons scatter, and bounded over with the same enthusiasm he'd shown when Daniel brought food in those early days. Daniel barely had time to brace himself before the young dragon was pressing his massive head against Daniel's chest, making sounds that were almost purrs. The force of it nearly knocked Daniel over, but Saren steadied him with one wing. "He has not stopped asking about you," Saren said, and there was warmth in his voice now. "Every day. Where is the kind human? When will Daniel come? Why did he leave without saying goodbye?" Daniel reached up and scratched behind Ember's horns the way he used to, though now he needed both hands to cover the same area. "I didn't leave, Ember." "You did. You disappeared and I thought you'd gone home." Ember pulled back and spoke, and Daniel nearly fell over again from shock because the voice was clear human language, young and bright and unmistakably excited. "Father came and found me, and said we had to leave immediately because there were bad people looking for me, and you were in danger if they found you first. I wanted to say goodbye, but Father said no time. I'm sorry, Daniel, I should have said goodbye. You gave me food when I was hungry and water when I was thirsty, and you talked to me about plants and rain, and you never hurt me even when I was too weak to stop you." The words came out in a rush without pause for breath. Saren placed a claw on his son's shoulder. "Breathe, Ashir. The human needs time to process. Remember, their minds work differently than ours." "Right. Sorry. Father says I talk too much when I'm excited." Ashir sat back on his haunches, tail swishing back and forth. "But you're really here, in the Imperial District. Grandfather wants to meet you. He's been preparing for 3 days. He never prepares for meetings, but he says you're special. Are you excited?" "I'm excited." Daniel couldn't help but smile. Beneath all the size and scales and impossible growth, this was still the same creature who'd listened to him ramble about tomato plants. "I'm a little terrified, actually. I don't know how to meet an emperor." "Be yourself," Saren advised. "That is what saved my son's life. That is what the emperor wishes to see." They led him deeper into the palace, through halls that grew larger and more ornate, until Daniel felt like an insect walking through a cathedral. Finally, they reached a chamber so vast he couldn't see the far wall. The ceiling was open to the sky, and a floating mountain hung directly overhead, close enough that its heat was noticeable even through Daniel's climate regulator. Emperor Volrath sat on a raised platform at the chamber's center, and he made every other dragon Daniel had seen look small by comparison. His scales were deep black like obsidian, but with veins of gold running through them that pulsed with light in rhythm with his breathing. His wings were folded against his back, but Daniel could see they would span the entire chamber if opened. Horns curved from his head in a crown more majestic than any human-made jewelry, and his eyes were ancient, holding thousands of years of memory in their depths. Saren and Ashir both bowed deeply. Daniel, not knowing what else to do, dropped to one knee the way he'd seen people do in old historical films. "Rise, human." Volrath's voice was like the planet itself speaking, resonant and vast. "I would see the face of the one who saved my grandson." Daniel stood up on shaking legs. Those ancient eyes studied him, taking in everything from his worn colony clothes to his nervous expression. The silence stretched out until Daniel thought he might break from the tension of it. "You are small," Volrath finally said. "Weak by the standards of most species. No natural weapons, no scales to turn away claws, no fire in your breath." The Emperor leaned forward slightly. "Yet you took what little you had and gave it freely to a dying stranger. Why?" Daniel thought about lying, about making himself sound noble or heroic. But Saren had said to be honest, and honestly seemed important when talking to someone who had lived for thousands of years. "Because he was suffering. Because I could help. Because walking away felt wrong." "Did you expect reward?" "No. I thought he was just an animal from the local ecosystem." "And when you learned he was a prince? Did that change how you felt about your choice?" Daniel considered this carefully. "It made me more nervous about meeting you, but no, it didn't change how I felt. I would have done the same thing for any creature that was starving." Volrath sat back. Several other dragons had gathered at the edges of the chamber watching. Daniel could feel their attention like pressure against his skin. The Emperor's tail moved slowly, the tip tapping against stone, in a rhythm that might have been thought. In 3,000 years of rule, Volrath said slowly, I have met countless beings. Warriors who conquered planets, scientists who unraveled the secrets of space itself, diplomats who could talk their way out of wars, artists whose work transcended language. He paused. But I have rarely met someone who acts without thought of gain, who sees suffering and moves to end it simply because it exists. That's just basic decency, Daniel said, then immediately wondered if contradicting an emperor was allowed. Is it? Volrath stood, and his sighs made Daniel's breath catch. I wonder. My people are strong, human. We have built an empire that spans 100 star systems. We are feared across the galaxy, but we stand alone. We do not help those weaker than ourselves unless it serves our interests. We do not share our resources freely. We do not think of others' suffering as our problem. The Emperor descended from his platform, each step deliberate. Perhaps we have forgotten what you call basic decency. Perhaps that is why we are strong but empty. He stopped directly in front of Daniel. One massive claw reached out, and Daniel forced himself not to flinch as it touched his shoulder with surprising gentleness. I offer you wealth beyond measure. Technology your species has not dreamed of. Status that would make you powerful among your own kind. Land on Paraxis itself, a place in my court. Whatever you desire if it is within my power to grant. Daniel looked at Ashir, who was watching with barely contained excitement. He looked at Saren, who gave the smallest nod of encouragement. He looked at all the impossibilities around him, the floating mountains and crystalline towers and dragons who could fly through space itself. I just want to go home, Daniel said quietly. Back to my greenhouse and my plants. But I'd like to visit sometimes, if that's allowed, to see Ashir, to make sure he's okay. The chamber went completely silent. Then Volrath threw back his head and laughed, a sound like thunder rolling across mountains. Of course that is what you would ask. He looked at the assembled dragons. This human is offered the wealth of empires and asks only to tend his plants and visit a friend. Let it be known across Pyraxis and beyond, humanity has shown us something we had forgotten, and for that they have earned our protection and respect. The Emperor's claw squeezed Daniel's shoulder once, carefully. You will have what you ask, Daniel Reed, and more. Your people will stand under the Dragon Emperor's protection for as long as my line rules. Any who threaten humanity will answer to Drakari fire. This I swear before my court. Daniel didn't understand the significance of those words yet. He would learn soon enough. But in that moment all he felt was relief that he could go home, and happiness that Ember Prince Ashir was safe and healthy. Sometimes, he thought, the simple things really were the most important. 6 months felt like both forever and no time at all. Daniel had returned to Verdant 7 after a week on Pyraxis, carrying gifts he'd tried to refuse but Ashir had insisted on giving him. A communication device that let him talk to the young prince across any distance, seeds from Pyraxis that grew in impossible colors, a small crystal that provided unlimited clean energy, casually given away like it was nothing, though the colony's engineers nearly wept when they saw it. Life had returned to normal in most ways. Daniel still worked his shifts in the greenhouse, still got dirt under his fingernails, still ate protein bars that tasted like cardboard. But normal had changed in ways that crept up slowly, like plants growing too gradually to notice until suddenly they were a foot taller. The first change was the trade ships. They used to come once every 3 months, sometimes longer if there were delays. Now they came weekly, and they didn't charge the usual extortionate fees for basic supplies. The captain of the first new ship had been apologetic about past pricing, stumbling over words as he explained that they had recently reviewed their rate structure and found they could offer much better terms. Governor Wells had pulled Daniel aside after that visit. They're scared of us. Did you see how that captain kept looking around like he expected dragons to appear? Word got out somehow. About you. About what happened on Pyraxis. I didn't tell anyone except you. Daniel protested. You didn't have to. The Drakari aren't exactly subtle. That ship in orbit was visible from 3 systems away, and every sensor array in this sector picked it up. People talk. And now everyone knows that Verdant 7 is under Dragon Emperor protection. The second change was harder to quantify. Ships from other species, ones that used to ignore the colony completely, started sending diplomatic messages, requests for meetings, offers of favorable trade agreements. The Merchant Confederacy, a collection of insectoid traders who'd been cheating human colonies on prices for years, suddenly sent a delegation to establish friendly relations. Daniel had watched their shuttle land with a mix of confusion and discomfort. 3 of the bug-like creatures had scuttled into the governor's office, their translator devices buzzing with overly formal apologies for past misunderstandings and promises of fair trade going forward. "This doesn't feel right," Daniel had told Wells afterward. "They're not being nice because they like us. They're being nice because they're afraid." "Does it matter why if it helps the colony?" Wells had asked, though her expression suggested she wasn't entirely comfortable with it either. The third change was the attacks. Not on Verdant 7, but on other human colonies. Small raids, testing responses, probing defenses. Outposts on the frontier reported ships appearing, scanning them, sometimes firing a few shots, then retreating before any damage was done. Earth's unified government received a formal communication from something calling itself the Sovereign League, demanding to know the true nature of humanity's relationship with the Drakari. Daniel learned about this from the news feeds, and then from a more direct source when his communication crystal activated in the middle of the night. Ashir's voice sounding worried in a way that made him seem younger than his age. "Daniel, are you safe? Father says there have been attacks on human settlements." "We're fine here," Daniel assured him, sitting up in his small quarters. Through the window, Verdant 7's moons cast purple shadows across the colony. "Nothing has happened on our world." "Good. Grandfather sent the 4th Fleet to patrol human space. Anyone who attacks your people will be destroyed." There was a pause. "Daniel, some of the other species are angry. They say we're expanding our territory by using humanity as a puppet. They don't understand that we're protecting friends, not conquering subjects. Maybe you should tell them that." "We have. They don't believe it. They think the Drakari don't have friends, only servants and enemies." Ashir's voice dropped lower. "Sometimes I think they're right. Before I met you, I didn't have friends either. Just other nobles who wanted to use my status or servants who feared me. You're the only one who ever just talked to me like I was normal." Daniel didn't know what to say to that. The idea that a prince, someone with power and status beyond imagination, could be lonely seemed backwards. But he remembered those days in the grass, sharing meals with what he'd thought was a herd animal, talking about nothing important because the creature seemed to like his voice. "I miss the talks we used to have," Ashir said quietly. "About your plants and the weather. Simple things. Everything here is politics and warfare and dynasty planning. I'm being trained to lead fleets, to make decisions that affect billions of lives. I'm 7 months old, Daniel. By human years, I'd still be a baby. But Drakari mature fast, and princes mature faster because they have to. Sometimes I wish I could just be small again, lying in the grass, listening to you worry about tomatoes." "You can visit whenever you want," Daniel offered. "The colony would probably panic, but I'd like to see you." "I'd like that too. Let me talk to Father about it. Maybe soon." The crystal went dark. Daniel lay back down but couldn't sleep. He thought about empires and protection and the weight of gifts he'd never asked for. All he'd done was share his lunch. How had that turned into fleets patrolling space and species changing their behavior out of fear? The attacks continued for another month, always small, always testing. Then one day they stopped. Daniel learned why when Governor Wells called an emergency assembly. Every colonist gathered in the square where the Drakari had first landed, and Wells projected a hologram for everyone to see. The image showed 3 warships burning in space, their hulls torn open by weapons that had melted through metal like it was paper. Drakari fighters swarmed around them, dragons flying through vacuum as easily as they flew through atmosphere. The caption underneath identified the destroyed ships as belonging to the Sovereign League. This footage was sent to every government in the galaxy, Wells explained, her voice tight, along with a message from Emperor Volrath himself. "Any act of aggression against humanity will be met with absolute force. This is not a negotiation. This is not a warning. This is a promise. The attacks have stopped. The Sovereign League has issued an apology and withdrawn from all human border space." Cheers went up from some colonists. Others looked uneasy. Daniel felt sick. He pushed through the crowd and went back to his greenhouse, seeking the familiar comfort of plants that didn't care about politics or empires. He was checking soil moisture levels when the alarms went off again. Not the emergency ones this time, but the visitor notification. Daniel's stomach dropped. He knew somehow what he would see when he went outside. 5 dragons descended from the sky, smaller than Saren had been, younger. Ashir led them, his golden scales catching the sun. He landed gracefully in the square, and the other young Drakari followed his example. They looked around at the colony with expressions Daniel was learning to read. Curiosity mixed with something like disdain. One of them, covered in silver scales with blue highlights, curled her lip at the greenhouse structures. "This is where you spent weeks, Ashir? In this primitive settlement with its crude buildings and simple beings?" Ashir's head snapped toward her. "Lady Saris, you will speak respectfully or you will leave. These are my friends." "Friends." Saris made the word sound like an insult. "Drakari do not have friends among lesser species. We have servants and we have prey. Your father humors your attachment, but don't pretend it's anything more than sentiment." Daniel had emerged from the greenhouse in time to hear this. Ashir saw him and immediately bounded over, his enthusiasm unchanged despite his companion's coldness. "Daniel, father said I could visit. I brought some of the other young nobles with me. They wanted to see humanity for themselves. To understand what all the fuss is about," another dragon added, this one copper-colored with green eyes. "No offense meant to you personally, human, but your species is causing considerable disruption in galactic politics. We thought it prudent to investigate why the Emperor considers you worthy of protection." Governor Wells had appeared, looking like she might faint. Other colonists gathered at a safe distance, staring at the dragons with expressions ranging from wonder to fear. Daniel felt something shift inside him. He was tired of politics, tired of being at the center of something he'd never wanted, tired of being judged by beings who saw his kindness as weakness. "You want to understand humanity?" Daniel asked. "Fine, you can stay and learn. Work with us.
Live like we live."
Maybe then you'll understand that we're not just some primitive species your emperor decided to protect on a whim." Saris laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Work? You expect Drakari nobles to perform manual labor? We are warriors and leaders, not farmers." "Then you'll learn nothing," Daniel said flatly. "You'll see buildings and think we're simple. You'll see our lack of claws and think we're weak. You'll never understand what your emperor saw." He looked at Ashir, who was watching him with those intelligent amber eyes. "I saved your life because you needed help. Because it was the right thing to do. If your friends can't understand that, then maybe they should just go home." Silence fell over the square. The young Drakari stared at Daniel like he'd grown a second head. Saris looked genuinely shocked that he'd spoken to her that way. Ashir's tail swished back and forth in what Daniel had learned was a sign of agitation. Then Governor Wells surprised everyone by stepping forward. "The human makes a fair point. If you want to understand us, you need to see how we live, not from above, but beside us." She looked at Daniel, then at the dragons, then back at Daniel with an expression that clearly said she couldn't believe what she was about to suggest. "We can arrange accommodations. You're welcome to stay as long as you like and participate in our daily operations, if you choose to." The copper dragon who'd introduced himself as Lord Brennus tilted his head thoughtfully. "That's actually not a terrible idea. Grandfather has been pushing the noble youth to understand other species better. This would be a practical education." Saris looked mutinous. "I'm not going to spend my days digging in dirt and growing plants." "Then go home," Ashir said quietly. "I'm staying." Daniel's right. We came here judging them without knowing them. That's exactly what Grandfather said we needed to stop doing. One by one, the other young dragons agreed to stay. Even Saris, though she made it clear she wasn't happy about it. Daniel watched them and wondered what he'd just gotten himself into. He had a feeling the next few weeks were going to be either very educational or completely disastrous. Probably both. The colony's engineers had to completely redesign the visitor quarters in 3 days. Dragons, it turned out, didn't fit in human-sized rooms. They also radiated enough heat that special cooling systems needed to be installed to prevent melting everything around them. By the time accommodations were ready, Daniel had already started what he privately called the Dragon Education Program, despite Governor Wells telling him to please not call it that where they could hear him. Day 1 began in the greenhouse. Daniel had decided if the young Drakari wanted to understand humanity, They should start with the thing he understood best. 5 dragons crowded into a space meant for maybe 10 humans, their scales reflecting off the glass walls in a dizzying array of colors. Ashir looked delighted. The others looked skeptical. These are tomato plants, Daniel explained, gesturing to rows of green vegetation. They're growing in soil we've had to specially treat because Verdant 7's native Earth lacks certain nutrients Earth plants need. We water them twice daily, check their mineral intake, monitor for pests, and adjust temperature based on their growth stage. Sarah stared at the plants with undisguised disdain. You spend your days keeping small green things alive. This is your contribution to your species? These small green things feed the colony, Daniel replied evenly. Without them, we'd rely entirely on synthetic food and supply ships. This greenhouse complex provides 40% of our fresh nutrition. So yes, this is my contribution. But where's the challenge? Brennis asked, sounding genuinely curious rather than condescending. The plants just grow on their own, don't they? Daniel plucked a leaf from a nearby plant and held it up. The young dragons leaned in. See these yellow spots? Nitrogen deficiency. This plant is slowly dying because the soil balance is wrong. If I don't catch it early, fix the problem, adjust the feeding schedule, we lose not just this plant but potentially the whole row if it's a systemic issue. He moved to another section. These ones have spider mites, tiny insects that drink the plant's fluids. Left alone, they'd destroy everything in here. We have to manually remove them because pesticides would contaminate the food. So you fight tiny enemies to protect weaker allies, the third dragon. A young female named Lissa with emerald scales said slowly. That's actually on strategic, small-scale warfare. I never thought of it that way, but sure. Daniel handed each of them a watering can sized for human hands, laughably small in their claws. You want to understand humanity? Start here. Water these rows. Carefully. Too much drowns the roots, too little stresses the plants. Find the balance. What followed was almost comical. Cirrus dumped her entire can on one plant, flooding it, and looked annoyed when Daniel explained she'd potentially killed it. Brennis was too cautious and barely wet the soil. Lissa treated it like a military operation, developing a system and pattern that actually worked pretty well. Ashir, who'd watched Daniel do this dozens of times during his recovery, performed the task perfectly and looked smug about it. The fifth dragon, a quiet one named Forge with scales like brushed steel, said nothing but observed carefully before acting. His watering was methodical and effective. Daniel got the feeling Forge was the smartest of the group, even if he didn't talk much. They spent the morning in the greenhouse. Daniel showed them how to check soil pH, how to identify different pest problems, how to carefully remove dead leaves without damaging healthy growth. It was monotonous work, the kind Daniel found peaceful but suspected the dragons found tedious. By lunch, Saris looked ready to set something on fire out of pure frustration. This is pointless, she announced. We're Drakari nobles. We command fleets and make decisions that affect entire worlds. What does any of this teach us about your species, except that you're content with small, meaningless tasks? Daniel set down his plant shears. It teaches you that we take care of things, that we don't just take what we need, we cultivate it, that we think ahead and plan and work for results that might not come for weeks or months. Your people are warriors who conquer and move on. My people are gardeners who plant and stay and nurture. He gestured at the greenhouse around them.
This is what your emperor saw in me.
Not that I'm strong or powerful, but that I understand growth takes time and attention. Ashir was a seed I helped grow. Ashir made a pleased chirping sound. Saris looked like she'd tasted something bitter. But she didn't argue anymore, just picked up her tools and went back to work. The following days brought new lessons. Daniel took them through the colony, showing them the water reclamation system where every drop was filtered and reused because water was too precious to waste. He showed them the machine shop where colonists repaired equipment with salvaged parts, because new equipment was expensive and took months to arrive. He showed them the school where human children learned, and the dragons were shocked to discover that unrelated adults taught offspring that weren't their own. Why would you invest time in younglings that don't carry your bloodline? Brennis asked, watching a teacher help a struggling student with mathematics. Because they're the future, the teacher, an elderly woman named Ruth, replied. All of them. Not just the ones related to me. We all benefit when everyone is educated. But you gain no direct advantage, Forge spoke up, his first words in 2 days. No genetic legacy, no increase in your own standing. By Drakari logic, it's inefficient, Ruth smiled. By human logic, it's called community. We're stronger together than we are alone. That evening, a severe storm warning came through. Verdant 7's weather was usually mild, but occasionally the twin suns aligned in a way that created atmospheric instability. The colony had 2 hours to secure everything before wind strong enough to tear apart buildings would hit. Every colonist mobilized immediately. Daniel was in the greenhouse frantically moving the most delicate plants into the reinforced storage area when the young dragons appeared. The governor said you might need help, Ashir said. What can we do? The external panels, Daniel said, pointing to large sheets of protective material stacked by the wall. They need to be installed over the glass sections to prevent shattering. But they're heavy and awkward, and I only have 2 other people helping me. The dragons moved before he finished explaining. What would have taken humans an hour of struggling with heavy materials took the Drakari 10 minutes of coordinated lifting and placing. Saris, despite her earlier complaints, worked efficiently and without protest. They moved on to the next building, then the next, helping colonists secure equipment and supplies. Daniel was hauling a crate of emergency supplies when he saw something that made his blood go cold. A group of children, maybe 7 or 8, years old, had been playing in the outer fields and hadn't made it back before the storm warning. They were running toward the colony now, but the wind was already picking up and debris had started to fly. One child tripped and fell, and a loose panel tore free from a nearby structure, tumbling directly toward them. Saris moved. Daniel would remember later that he'd never seen anything move that fast. She flew the 100 yards in a heartbeat and threw herself over the children, wings spread wide. The panel hit her back with a sound like a bell being struck. Her scales deflected it, but the impact drove her to the ground. She didn't move until the children crawled out from under her protective wings, shaken but unharmed. Daniel ran over as Saris stood up, a visible crack in one of her wing membranes. "You're hurt," he said. "It's minor." Saris looked at the children, who were staring at her with wide eyes. "Are they undamaged?" "You saved us," the smallest child said. "You protected us." Something crossed Saris's face, an expression Daniel couldn't quite read. The children didn't run away or act afraid. One of them reached out and touched her foreclaw, a gesture of trust and gratitude. Saris looked at that, small hand on her scales like she'd never seen anything quite like it before. They got everyone to safety before the storm hit in full force. The colony sheltered in the reinforced central buildings while the wind howled outside like a living thing. Humans and dragons crowded together, the climate differences forgotten in the face of shared danger. Someone had brought food, and Daniel found himself sharing ration bars with the young Drakari just like he'd once shared his lunch with a dying hatchling. "Why did you do it?" Daniel asked Saris quietly while the storm raged. "Save those children. You could have been seriously hurt." Saris was silent for a long time. Her wing was bandaged now, treated by the colony's medic who'd been terrified but professional. "I don't know," she finally admitted. "I saw them in danger. I moved. I didn't think about efficiency or gain or whether it served my interests." She looked at Daniel with those alien eyes. "Is that what you felt? When you found Ashir?" "Yes," Daniel said. "Exactly that." "It's uncomfortable," Saris said. "Caring about beings you have no obligation toward. Feeling responsible for their well-being. Is it always this uncomfortable?" "Sometimes, but it's also what makes us human." Daniel smiled slightly. "Well, human in spirit if not in species. I think that's what your emperor wanted you to learn. That there's strength in caring, not just in conquering." The storm passed. The colony emerged to find damage, but nothing catastrophic. The protective measures had worked, and the dragon's help had prevented worse. As they cleaned up debris the next morning, Daniel watched the young Drakari working alongside colonists. Not ordering them, not conquering them, but helping them. Saris carried materials for repairs, her injured wing folded carefully. Brennus used his size to lift structural beams that would have required machines. Lissa organized work crews with military efficiency. Forge assisted the engineers with technical problems. his sharp mind finding solutions they hadn't considered. And Ashir moved between groups, encouraging everyone, his natural enthusiasm infectious. Governor Wells found Daniel watching them. "You've done something remarkable," she said. "I think they're learning." "I hope so," Daniel replied. "Because I think we're going to need them to teach other Drakari what they've learned here. The Empire is huge, and Ashir and his friends are just 5 young dragons. But sometimes seeds grow into forests." Wells laughed. "Always back to the plants with you." "It's a good metaphor," Daniel defended. "Plants don't grow overnight. Neither does understanding between species. But if you're patient and you take care of things, eventually something beautiful happens." That night Daniel's communication crystal activated, but it wasn't Ashir's voice. It was deeper, resonant with age and power. Emperor Volrath. "Daniel Reed. My grandson has been sending me reports of his time on your colony, reports that have been illuminating. I have a request to make of you, if you would hear it." Daniel's mouth went dry. "Of course, Emperor. I wish to visit Earth, to speak before your leaders and your people, to see for myself the world that creates beings like you, and to show the galaxy that humanity is not our puppet, but our partner." There was a pause. "Would you accompany me? As a guide and translator, not of language, but of culture. I wish to understand your people as you have helped my grandson understand them." Daniel thought about the greenhouse, his quiet life, the simple pleasure of making things grow. He thought about empires and politics and responsibilities he'd never asked for. He thought about Ashir and Saris protecting children, and the possibility that maybe, just maybe, something good could grow from all of this. "Yes," Daniel said. "I'll help however I can." "Thank you, Daniel Reed. We leave in 2 weeks. And Daniel, my grandson tells me you have taught his companions something valuable. Perhaps it is time I learned those lessons as well." The crystal went dark. Daniel sat in his small room on his small colony on the edge of human space, and wondered how sharing his lunch with a starving creature had led to this moment. The universe, he decided, had a strange sense of humor, but also maybe a sense of hope. Geneva had seen many historic moments in its long existence, but nothing quite like this. The city had been preparing for 2 weeks, ever since the announcement that Emperor Volrath himself would visit Earth. Streets had been cleaned, security increased, and every news organization in human space had descended on the city like a swarm. Daniel watched it all from his hotel room window and felt increasingly out of place. He'd been fitted for formal clothes, something he'd protested but Governor Wells had insisted on. "You can't meet world leaders in your gardening coveralls," she'd said firmly. So now he wore a suit that felt stiff and uncomfortable, nothing like his usual work clothes. At least they'd let him keep his worn boots. Some battles weren't worth fighting. A knock at his door. Daniel opened it to find Ashir, who'd grown even larger in the months since they'd first met. The young prince could no longer fit through standard human doors, so he'd opted to meet Daniel on the building's rooftop instead. "Father says the delegation is ready. Are you nervous?" Terrified, Daniel admitted as they took the elevator up. "I'm a botanist, Ashir. I grow tomatoes. I'm not qualified to advise emperors or speak before world governments." "Grandfather doesn't want advice from a politician or a general," Ashir said. "He has thousands of those. He wants your perspective, the view from someone who sees value in small things and treats everyone with equal respect." The elevator opened onto the rooftop, where wind whipped at Daniel's new clothes. "You're more qualified than you think." The Drakari delegation was assembled in the square outside the Unified Government Assembly Hall. Emperor Volrath dominated the space, his obsidian scales seeming to absorb light rather than reflect it. High Commander Saren stood at his right, and to Daniel's surprise, Lady Saris, Lord Brennus, Lissa, and Forge were there too, all looking considerably more mature than they had weeks ago. Volrath's ancient gaze found Daniel. "Walk with me, botanist. I would hear your thoughts before we enter." They moved through the crowd, security forces keeping a respectful distance. Humans lined the streets, watching in awe and fear. Daniel saw both admiration and anxiety in their faces. The Emperor noticed too. They fear us, he observed. Some do, Daniel agreed. Not because you've hurt us, but because power is frightening when you don't understand its intentions. Humans have been at the mercy of more advanced species before. We've learned to be cautious. Yet you were not cautious with my grandson. You showed no fear. He was dying. Fear seemed less important than helping. Volrath made a sound that might have been approval. They reached the assembly hall, where Earth's president and representatives from every major government waited. Daniel had met President Okonkwo briefly during preparation. She was a sharp woman in her 60s who'd risen from refugee camps to lead the unified government, and she'd given Daniel one crucial piece of advice. Just be honest. Dragons respect honesty more than pretty words. The assembly hall had been modified for the occasion. The ceiling had been removed entirely, opening the space to the sky so Volrath could be comfortable. Thousands of seats surrounded a central floor where human leaders sat at one table and the Drakari delegation at another, sized appropriately for each species. Daniel was given a seat between the two tables, literally positioned as a bridge. President Okonkwo stood to speak first. Her voice carried through the hall and was broadcast to billions watching across Earth and human space. Emperor Volrath, honored delegates of the Drakari Empire, we welcome you to Earth. This historic moment marks the first time your people have formally visited our homeworld, and we receive you as we hope to be received in return, as equals, as partners, and as friends. Volrath rose, and his presence silenced even the rustle of movement. President Okonkwo, representatives of humanity, I come before you to speak truth. For 10,000 years my people have viewed yours as beneath notice, too weak to matter, too primitive to warrant attention. We were wrong. He paused, letting the words sink in. One of your kind, a simple botanist from a frontier colony, showed my grandson mercy when he had no reason to do so. He gave what little he had, expecting nothing in return. This singular act revealed something my empire had forgotten in our pursuit of strength. That power without compassion is empty. That dominance without understanding is hollow. The Emperor gestured toward Daniel, and thousands of eyes turned his way. Daniel resisted the urge to sink into his chair. This human teaches that true strength lies not in the ability to destroy, but in the choice to protect. Not in taking what you want, but in giving what others need. My grandson spent time among your people. He learned to work beside those weaker than himself. He learned that cooperation achieves what force cannot. He learned that caring for others is not weakness, but the foundation of community. Volrath's gaze swept across the assembled humans. I am here to propose something unprecedented in Drakari history. Not an alliance of convenience, but a partnership of mutual learning. Your species will teach mine the arts of cooperation, community, and compassion. In return, we offer our technology, our protection, and our respect. Not as masters and servants, but as two civilizations walking forward together. The chamber erupted in discussion. Some voices were excited, others concerned. One ambassador stood, an older man from the Asian coalition. With respect, Emperor, how can we trust that this isn't simply another form of control? You speak of partnership, but your empire controls hundreds of worlds. What assurance do we have that humanity won't become just another territory under Drakari rule? A fair question, Volrath acknowledged. Daniel Reed, would you stand? Daniel's heart hammered as he rose. Every eye in the hall was on him now, human and Drakari alike. I know this is frightening, he said, and was amazed his voice didn't shake. I was terrified when High Commander Saren came to my colony. I thought I'd done something wrong. But what I learned on Pyraxis is that the Drakari aren't trying to conquer us. They're trying to understand us. He looked at Volrath. The Emperor has lived for 3,000 years. He's seen empires rise and fall. He doesn't need to trick humanity into submission. If he wanted to control us, we couldn't stop him. Instead, he's here asking to learn from us. That matters. But why should we believe it will last? Another voice, a woman from the European Federation. What happens when you die, Emperor? Will your successor honor this partnership? Volrath was quiet for a moment. I will not live forever, though my kind lives long. But I have an heir who understands humanity's value. My grandson, Prince Ashir, stepped forward. Ashir moved to the center of the floor, and Daniel saw the young dragon he'd fed in the grass now standing before the leaders of humanity, with confidence and grace. I was dying when Daniel found me, Ashir said, his voice carrying clearly. I was alone and afraid, and he helped me anyway. He talked to me about plants and weather and simple everyday things. He treated me like I mattered, not because of my title but because I was suffering and he could help. The young prince looked at the assembled humans. I want to be the kind of leader who remembers that lesson. The Drakari Empire is strong because we conquered. I want it to be strong because we care, because we protect, because we build things together instead of just taking what we want. Cirrus stepped forward next, and Daniel noticed her wing had healed completely. I came to Verdant 7 believing humans were weak and worthless. I watched a child reach out to touch me with trust after I'd been cruel to their people. I felt what it was like to protect someone for no other reason than they needed protection. She addressed the human leaders directly. Your species has something mine has lost. The ability to see strangers as potential friends rather than threats or resources. We need to learn this. We need you to teach us. One by one, the other young Drakari spoke. Brennus talked about efficiency and how human cooperation achieved better results than Drakari individualism. Lysa described the storm on Verdant 7 and how working together had saved lives. Forge, in his quiet way, explained how human innovation came from sharing knowledge rather than hoarding it. President Okonkwo listened to it all, then looked at Daniel. Mr. Reed, you've spent more time with the Drakari than any other human. Do you believe this partnership can work? Daniel thought carefully before answering. I believe the Emperor is sincere. I believe Ashir and his generation want something different than what their empire has been. But I also think this will be hard. Really hard. Humans and Drakari think differently. We value different things. There will be misunderstandings and conflicts. He paused. But yes, I think it can work. If both sides are willing to learn and be patient and remember that growth takes time. Always back to the gardening metaphors, Okonkwo said with a slight smile. She stood and addressed the assembly. The unified government will need time to discuss this formally. But speaking personally, I believe this is an opportunity humanity cannot afford to miss, not just for the protection or technology, but for the chance to help shape what the most powerful military force in the galaxy becomes. If we can teach them our values, if we can influence the next generation of Drakari leadership, we change the future for every species in this galaxy. The formal discussions lasted for hours. Treaties were drafted, terms negotiated, concerns addressed. Daniel participated when asked but mostly watched as two civilizations worked to build something new. By evening, the framework was set. Joint cultural centers would be established on Earth and Paraxis. Young Drakari would study among humans and humans would be welcome in the Drakari Empire. Technology transfers would occur gradually, ensuring humanity could adapt without becoming dependent. Most importantly, humanity would maintain its independence and sovereignty. The Drakari protection was offered freely, not as a price for control. When it was done, when the documents were signed and the broadcasts had ended, Daniel found himself on the rooftop again with Ashir and the Emperor. The sun was setting, painting Earth's sky in colors that reminded Daniel of Paraxis. You seem troubled, Volrath observed. I'm wondering if I did the right thing, Daniel admitted. My species is pinning a lot of hope on a promise that you'll stay true to your word, that your people will learn what you want them to learn. What if it doesn't work? What if I helped create something that hurts humanity in the long run? These are wise concerns, Volrath said. You would not be the person you are if you didn't worry about consequences. The ancient dragon settled onto the rooftop, making himself smaller, less imposing. But consider this, Daniel Reed. Before you shared your meal, what would have happened to my grandson? He would have died. Yes, and I would have destroyed planets in my grief and rage seeking those who harmed him. I would have burned entire civilizations for revenge. Instead, you saved him. You gave him life and showed him kindness. Because of that, instead of rage and destruction, I am here seeking peace and partnership. Volrath's eyes held depths Daniel couldn't fathom. You asked if you did the right thing. You prevented a war that would have killed billions. You changed the path of the most powerful empire in the galaxy toward compassion instead of conquest. You gave my grandson a friend and my people a future where they can be more than they are. I would say yes, Daniel Reed. You did the right thing. I just shared my lunch, Daniel said quietly. And that, Volrath replied, is exactly why it mattered. Because to you it was just sharing lunch. Not a political calculation, not a strategic move, but a simple act of decency. The Emperor stood, spreading wings that blocked out the sky. Never lose that simplicity, botanist. The galaxy needs more people who see a stranger in need and simply help. That is the lesson you taught my grandson, and the one I hope your species will teach mine. 5 years passed. Daniel returned to Verdant 7 in his greenhouse, though he traveled frequently now. The cultural exchange program had grown beyond anyone's expectations. Drakari students studied at human universities, learning history and philosophy and art. Human engineers worked alongside Drakari technicians, blending innovation with ancient knowledge. Joint colonies were established where both species lived together, learning to navigate their differences. Ashir visited Earth regularly, and Daniel visited Paraxis just as often. The young prince was being groomed for leadership, but he always made time for his friend. They would sit in gardens, Earth's or Paraxis's, and talk about plants and weather and simple things just like they had in the grass all those years ago. The Sovereign League, seeing the success of the human-Drakari partnership, had requested to join. Other species followed. The alliance grew, built on the model of mutual respect and cooperation that Daniel had unknowingly demonstrated in a field on Verdant 7. Not everything was perfect. There were still conflicts, misunderstandings, and species who refused to trust the Drakari or humans. But the trend was clear. The galaxy was changing, shifting from a place of conquest and domination to one where different species could work together. On a quiet afternoon in his greenhouse, Daniel was teaching a class of mixed students, human and Drakari, about sustainable agriculture. A young dragon, barely bigger than Ashir had been when they first met, raised a claw. "Professor Reed, why do you spend so much time on plants? You could be famous, meet with leaders, shape policy. Instead, you're here getting dirt under your claws." Daniel smiled. "Because this matters. These plants feed people. This knowledge helps worlds grow their own food instead of depending on imports. And because someone needs to remember that the big, important things start small. Empires and alliances and peace between species, those all begin with simple choices. With deciding to help instead of walking away. With sharing what you have even when it's not much." He held up a seedling, tiny and fragile, in his dirt-stained hands. "This is an oak tree seed from Earth. Right now it's small enough to crush with 2 fingers. But if you plant it and take care of it, in 100 years it'll be strong enough to shelter a whole community. That's what we're doing here. Planting seeds. Some of you will grow up to be leaders and warriors and scientists. But I hope you'll remember that the strongest things grow slowly, and the most important work is often the simplest." The class ended. Students filed out, chattering in multiple languages and roars. Daniel stayed behind, checking on his plants, making notes about growth rates and soil conditions. Through the greenhouse window he could see Drakari ships in orbit alongside human vessels, working together on a deep space survey mission. He could see a group of humans and dragons playing some kind of combined sport in the colony square, making up rules as they went. He could see the future taking root. His communication crystal activated, Ashir's voice warm with affection. "Daniel, Father says to remind you that you promised to visit next month for my inauguration as High Prince. Please tell me you haven't forgotten." "I haven't forgotten," Daniel assured him, "though I still don't understand why you need me there. It's a Drakari ceremony." "Because you're family," Ashir said simply. "You saved my life. You taught me what it means to care about others. You showed me that strength and kindness aren't opposites. I need you there because you remind me who I want to be." Daniel felt his throat tighten with emotion. "I'll be there. I promise." "Good, and Daniel? Thank you. For everything. For sharing your lunch with a starving stranger. For seeing someone who needed help and choosing to care. You changed my life. You changed the entire galaxy. I hope you know that." The crystal went dark. Daniel stood in his greenhouse, surrounded by growing things, and thought about all the impossible events that had led to this moment. He'd never wanted to be important or famous or influential. He'd just wanted to help something that was suffering. But maybe that was enough. Maybe that was everything. Outside, the twin suns were setting on Verdant 7, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. A small group of dragons and humans walked together toward the dining hall, talking and laughing. Somewhere in orbit, fleets from a dozen species worked together to explore the unknown, and in a greenhouse on the edge of human space, a botanist watered his plants and smiled, knowing that the seeds he'd planted, in soil and in hearts, were growing into something beautiful. He'd shared his lunch with a starving dragon hatchling. The Dragon Emperor had come to thank him. And in the end, both their worlds were better for it. Sometimes, Daniel thought as he locked up the greenhouse for the night, The smallest acts of kindness really do change everything. You just have to be patient enough to watch them grow.